Welcome everybody to our 5th episode. I'm very happy to have Haynes by my side, and I'm gonna give him a little introduction. But before we start, what we're gonna talk about today is the skill of competing. So last week we had his brother on, and we briefly discussed this topic, but today we're gonna go more in depth. Is there anything you would like to say before we start?
No, good to be back. I think I'd like to probably offer some perspective from both the coaching side of things and
Nice.
probably the athlete side of things as well, which I think are two very different hats to be wearing when you talk about this conversation.
Absolutely
so,
true.
Yeah.
And the cool thing is actually Ed is going to be competing this weekend
Yeah.
in Bangkok, so he has both perspectives and he has athletes competing at the same time. So that's a very interesting combo right there, right? So how would you like to introduce this concept of competition as a skill?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to probably layer this with when we talk about competing is that for most people probably listening to this is the idea of training versus the idea of competing. And I think it's important to kind of create some form of definition between the two, because for a lot of people who train in a competitive environment, it's sometimes hard to distinguish the difference between training with a group of friends where you're pushing each other and you're kind of feeding off that group environment and the camaraderie, versus being in a competition setting where there is a leaderboard and there are strict lanes and there's spectators. I think those are two very different things. I think what Ant talked about last week was he touched on things like the skill of competing, which we might talk about today. And I think that being in that group environment can definitely lend to being more effective or be able to execute more effectively in a competition setting, but it is still two very different beasts. So I think kind of when we talk about the training scenario versus the competing scenario is that typically when we train, or at least like what we like to think about training with our athletes and ourselves as athletes, is that typically most of our time spent training is we're accumulating. When we talk about accumulating, we're basically meaning we tend to be working more sub-maximally. We might have more of a kind of an idea on health, or a kind of a viewpoint on health and longevity versus kind of like giving absolute everything to a training session or whatever the stimulus is. So when we talk about accumulating, we're basically talking about sub-maximal efforts and intensity where we're striving for perfection as much as possible. Hopefully. When you get into competing, often competition is validating the quality of your training in the year or in the months leading up to it.
With validating, do you mean testing?
So I guess what it means is I mean is basically the way that we train, because when we compete, we essentially run on autopilot. So when we're in a competition scenario, that's not really the time to be thinking about technique, how to refine a certain movement, how to be more effective with a certain movement. That's all the kind of great stuff that we work on in the training environment. So when we get into that competition setting, we basically resort to autopilot. Now, if you've spent a whole year where your standard of training has been sub-maximal, guess what's going to happen when you step on the training floor? The quality of your standard, the quality of your movement is also going to be sub-maximal. So what I mean by that is that your competition validates the standard of your training in the year, and we often see that, especially in a sport like CrossFit, where there are specific movement standards, and we kind of know as a population what looks like a good repetition or good movement for a certain movement, and what doesn't look like good movement. So it's really easy to kind of to validate or quantify or judge how well someone approaches that training environment.
So do you mean that your training should involve that aspect of competition and treating certain days or certain tests, certain workouts as a competition?
I think it's hard whether you kind of train individually or you train in a group environment. It's a balancing act, right? So basically what we're saying is that, all right, today do I want to sacrifice some quality with my movement for some more intensity, or perhaps the other way around? Do I want to sacrifice some intensity today and focus more on like skill quality or quality of movement? And I think like whether you're in a group environment or not, that is a balancing act. And I think even competing is a balancing act. But typically what we say in a competition environment is that we want to ride that fine line between like good rep and a no rep, potentially, if we're talking about the sport of CrossFit, because that's efficiency. Right? So if a standard in a squat clean is hips pass below parallel, like how much more advantage are we getting by going ass to
All the
grass
way, yeah.
versus passing just below it. So
that's a good example.
yeah, I think the whole idea of like it's a balancing act really basically means my answer is it depends. So there are going to be some times in the training year or in your training week, or based upon, we talked about stress in one of our other podcasts, how the body's feeling, where it might be appropriate to sacrifice some movement quality just for a bit more kind of like grunt work, a bit more intensity, a bit more effort. But there are going to be other times, in the year, perhaps in a pre-season or in a time when other stresses in life are higher, where we actually take intensity out of it and we focus a little bit more on like the skill quality piece.
Let's say I train and I approach each training very consciously, and I'm very aware of the way I move, and I make it as perfect as possible. How can I make sure that translates into that competition scenario? Or how can I make that transition to competition? Because now I've spent so much time refining that movement and stuff like that, being comfortable with that. How can I make that switch to be more competition ready, which requires me to maybe, be more stressful, go faster, make transitions?
Well, I mean, I think that in itself is very, very hard, because often when we talk about improving the quality of a movement, probably the first thing we're going to do as a coaching team when we're working with an athlete is isolate the movement. Yeah. Right. So let's take, for example, let's say
dumbbell snatch, or
let's say dumbbell snatch or a handstand push-up, and we have someone who is struggling to increase their capacity with a movement, and we identify that it's actually like a technique or maybe a motor control issue that's hindering them from being able to do bigger sets reps. So what we would typically do, our approach would be isolate the movement and bring up capacity in an isolated setting. Now, we could spend 3 months, 6 months, 12 months just isolating the movements, but really when you apply something like a handstand push-up to the sport, and where we often see it in a competition scenario,
or combined with other,
we never really see it by itself. Exactly. True. Right. It's kind of in a mixed modal fatigue based setting often, which means that there's going to have to be a time in your training where you actually take that handstand push-up out of the isolated setting, even if that's yielding good results, and you have to kind of combine it with the mayhem and the chaos of what this sport asks of us if we're talking about competing. So, I mean, you can have someone who gets, develops chest to bar capacity in an isolated setting, and they develop a really strong, heavy 1 rep max snatch. But when you put chest to bars and snatches together, they're kind of like decompression and compression of the shoulder and the stabilizing of the diaphragm, breathing and extension and flexion. Suddenly, they can't do either.
Changes the game,
Exactly. So kind of the beauty of this sport is that there are 10,000 different combinations that we can put together. Each is going to yield a very, very different dose response. And until you've kind of been exposed to those combinations, it's very hard to ask someone to compete to the best of their ability if they haven't done it in their training scenario. Wow. And I think that's kind of training age and just being involved in the sport and is so important. Yeah. But I think, the takeaway message there to most people was going to be, it doesn't mean that we should change up our structured, isolated view on training for this sport to just be chaotic and mayhem. That's where we can talk about tapering and peaking for competition, because the closer we get to a competition, that's when we have to expose someone to more of that kind of stuff. Yeah. And I think, when we get into this sport, what makes this sport so unique is often when we compete, we know the workouts ahead of time, which is actually kind of crazy, right? Yeah. And I think what, the beautiful thing about the sport, or maybe not the beautiful thing about the sport, is that there's no outside circumstances that should affect our performance on the competition floor. It's an individual sport, yes. When we play tennis, if I was playing tennis against you, I'm having to react to your shots. So therefore, yes, it's individual sport, but really there's a big element of reactivity and being able to read another player. True. Because whoever can do that essentially better is going to win the match. Yeah. In CrossFit, typically, what you're doing has no bearing on how well I'm going to perform. No. So really, that means is that if I have the workouts and I'm able to practice them ahead of time, competing just means executing, right? Because we've often run through the workout numerous times, once, twice, 3 times. We have a strategy written out. We know exactly when we're going to break, when we're going to rest, when we're going to go on and hold unbroken. We know within kind of a 2 to 3 second time, if we execute the best as possible, this is going to be my time for the workout. I don't really think there's any other sport that actually where that is a case where you're not affected by an opponent. Yeah. So I think we've probably gone on a bit of a tangent there, but I think this competing within this sport is very, very unique. And I think mindset and things like that becomes so important at being able to execute on game day.
So we're talking about competition as a skill, and you compared competition with regards to training, and then you spoke about being in your own lane when competing. Is that could that be a resume of what you just said?
For sure, I think that's, when you see, you watch a lot of great athletes, people we aspire to, like the Catrins and the Matt Frasers, and I think that's probably something that we hear a lot.
Yeah.
Is that just focus on staying in my own lane.
True.
And I think if we were to take something like regionals as an example, where the athletes do have this opportunity to practice and practice and practice ahead of time, that's when the idea of staying in your lane probably becomes really, really important. Because like we just said, like you've done the workout 100 times and it's just about executing. True. And if you execute the way that you do in your training, then like what the result's going to be.
Yeah.
Now, where it becomes a bit different is that when you're in a competition scenario, let's say something like the games where you don't know the workouts, where maybe you turn up on game day and suddenly like, this is the stimulus, 3, 2, 1, go. Then that's a very different skill of competing. That's like understanding what it's like to be in the lead and being chased, or chasing the leader. That's a very easy way to articulate it. Like for some people, let's say someone like Matt Fraser probably spends a lot of time being in that like front pack of a workout. It would be interesting to put Matt Fraser suddenly, like if you said to Matt Fraser, you have to start every workout 2 minutes behind everyone else, so you're now chasing the pack. It'd be interesting to see like how he would do in that environment. So I think, to be a really great competitor, you need to have both those things down in the sport. You need to be able to execute what you do in training on game day, something like at the regional level, but you also need to be able to kind of like take whatever's thrown at you, formulate a game plan, and then execute. And then obviously, we're probably still going to say stay in your lane, do your thing based on your ability and your capacity. But if there's 100 points on the board and the guy or the girl in front of you is 20 meters ahead, like you have to make a decision then and there with regards to like, do you want to push to potentially take a risk and win the event, or are you going to be more mindful and think about tomorrow and the day after that and just hold back? So like, I think good athletes, that comes very naturally. A lot of good athletes come into the sport of CrossFit and have to learn this whole kind of skill and art of like practicing and then executing. Because as I said, like I don't think that really applies to any other sport.
True. I want to ask something that is maybe relatable to this competition as a skill, because let's say people go to a competition, the environment is totally different. It's not in their own box, the environment is different. The heat times, you need to wait a long time between the workouts, it's draining. How are you prepping yourself? Could you shed some light on how people could best prepare for being in a competition and taking as much control as possible of the different factors?
Think one thing that kind of jumped to my mind straight away there is not ever getting too comfortable with your training environment. Right. Nice. So then you see this a lot. You see a lot of people like, in the open, they always perform very, very well because they are in the own comfort of their own environment. So they get to use the same barbell, they use the same chalk, they use the same rower, they use the same pull-up bar, they're facing the same wall every time. Now, if you get too comfortable with those kind of like, I call them home comforts, suddenly when you're taken out of that environment, like I see a lot of athletes break down because suddenly they don't have those things they can rely on. Or they go to the judge and say, oh, can I move the ring down 2 centimeters because that's what I'm used to? And they're like, no, like this is the standard of the competition. Or, can I use this dumbbell? Can I use this kettlebell because it's got more rust on the handle, which I'm more used to? I've seen it happen so many times. So I think, one first thing is like never get too comfortable in your training environment. So for me, I know certainly, and I say it a lot to my athletes, is like, don't just choose one training bar. Like use a different bar every time. Change your pull-up bars. Face this direction today, face this direction tomorrow. And like you need to be adaptable, because the more adaptable you're going to be, the more successful you can be when you get taken out in that environment. But I think your question was were you asking kind of like if you have the opportunity to practice the workouts, what could you do to set yourself up for success?
I think that's awesome. Like what you just said is being exposed to different variables and changing up your equipment could potentially prepare you well for that. The randomness of competition.
And that's exactly it. It's random and it's chaotic. So like if your training environment is always set up to be comfortable and cushy, suddenly like you've got to be prepared to step away from it. I think people who know how to compete really well, they have in their mind like what the most ideal performance looks like, and that's like visualization. That's a whole nother conversation. But you can visualize the perfect performance, but rarely when we compete, do you have a perfect performance? So then it's about like adjusting and adapting on the fly. And the more quality you've had with your training, the more you can access those like memories and those experiences on game day and do it.
Wow.
Now, if you've had a very narrow-minded training focus all the time, so you only do certain things a certain way, and you haven't played around like different foot positions, different positions in a gym, suddenly when you're facing that scenario on a competition floor where you have to run an autopilot, you have nothing else to access because you've had one sub-maximal, sub-optimal way of doing everything every time that now like you're out of your environment, like, and that's where like good athletes will thrive.
Wow. Absolutely awesome. I think we could wrap it up with that point, or is there anything else that you would like to say with regards to this topic?
You know, I think Ant actually touched on this last week a little bit. He talked about having a why. Yeah, that's exactly it. And I think for anyone who is interested in competing, firstly, like you have to have a good why. So when we're talking about having a why, it's like, you know, why really do you want to compete? Because the beautiful thing about competing and the not so beautiful thing about competing is that often people put themselves into a position that they're not often in. So that means like, you know, pushing a little bit harder in a workout, maybe going for a lift that you wouldn't normally go to, maybe like holding on for extra 3 reps that you've never done before. And that's kind of the beauty of competition, because often people like, it's a big journey of self-discovery because they put themselves in that scary, dangerous, exciting environment. They start to do things they never would normally do.
True.
But I mean, when it comes to having a why, your why becomes your justification for why you want to do that stuff, right? So if for example, my why was to make it to regionals and therefore I needed to finish top 10 in Asia in the Open, that's a much greater, and you know, why I want to do regionals is because, you know, that's a source of income for me. It grants me more exposure through Instagram or social media, and that's going to attract sponsorship, and then therefore it's a livelihood, and this is my identity. Like, those are 5 really strong like reasons as to why someone might identify and have a reason for why they want to make regionals. Now, when you're in the thick of like a workout in the Open where like it's really hurting real bad and you're kind of, and like, you know, you're questioning your life decisions, having that strong why is when you kind of resort to it.
Yeah.
So reminding yourself that, like, you know, I have these 5 really important things. I'm willing to make myself hurt that little bit more in order to get there. Now, if you're someone who's competing in the next lane to that guy or girl, and your why is, I'm just doing this for fun, and like, it looks cool when I post a video on social media, and like, I want to talk to my friends about it afterwards, that's not a very strong why. That's probably going to allow you or warrant you to want to push your body into that same hole that the guy or the girl's next to you is doing. So I think always having that why and having that really clearly defined can really set yourself up for success, and not failure, but, you know, maybe more clearly defined success and have more tangible goals to chase towards.
That's awesome. Great. So to do a little recap, and I would love to maybe we'll do this together, the recap, so everybody gets an understanding of this episode. So a little summary. We spoke about competition as a skill. We spoke about, so you compared competition and with regards to training.
Yes, and that competition is a function of how good your training has been in the year.
Absolutely
generally.
True. Then we spoke about a couple of takeaways that people could try out in their own home gym or during their training, changing up the variables, changing up the way they do things, just to be prepared for that randomness of competition.
Yeah.
Right? And then the last thing we spoke about, I think, is the why. So having a strong why could help you when it matters the most, right? Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Saed.
And good luck in Bangkok. I'll be cheering for you. And see you on the next time.